The moment the truth slipped out, everything shattered. Because this was never just about family, never just about reconciliation, and certainly never just about forgiveness. This was about money. And the second that secret deal leaked, the entire royal illusion cracked in front of everyone watching.
It is war! The Daily Mail destroy Prince Harry. The Duke of Sussex's public humiliation is now complete. Not only will the cost of his failed lawsuit against the publishers of the Daily Mail further deplete his finances, be clear, Harry is broke. His reputation has been absolutely wiped out.
Breaking today, Meghan Markle has just disgustingly broken the terms of the Sandringham Summit in her latest TV farce, because I am completely disgusted by the fact that confirmation of Ms. Markle as a guest judge on MasterChef Australia shows that she is absolutely making money off her so-called royal connections.
I think he's so devious and led by her that the whole let's get back in with the king thing is based on two facts. One, the king is ill.
Yes.
And they see an opportunity to perhaps manufacture or wheedle their way, that's an English word, back in.
He's got a very expensive lifestyle, very expensive wife, and they expect to live in a certain manner, and they are going through cash like something else. They're not making the money from the contracts that they thought they'd make. He made a good load of money from his book and Netflix contract originally, but a lot of these things, they might be front-loaded, but they're not worth the 100 million plus that many people thought they were going to be worth. And actually, he just wanted to bring this case because he wanted some money.
A king trusted his son with one simple condition, one fragile boundary that was supposed to hold together what little remained of a broken relationship. And that boundary was silence, privacy, dignity. But what unfolded instead felt less like betrayal and more like something calculated, something rehearsed, something that had been quietly building behind closed doors long before that meeting ever took place. Because here's the detail people can't ignore anymore. This wasn't just a private conversation gone wrong. This wasn't just another emotional fallout. This was the moment where whispers turned into a pattern, and the pattern started pointing in one direction that nobody inside the palace wanted to admit out loud.
Interesting though, as this particular development happened, Harry told, and this is from an excellent source, that he was going to reel back from public exposure. To you and I, that means endless interviews, whinging on. Well, that was a tissue of lies, because literally 2 days before, he called His Majesty's government a whitewash. Now, this is all just put down to, oh, Harry's hot-headed. He's an imbecile. You don't see that, particularly when they hold the power in their hands as to what happens to you next.
A new recording surfaces, and suddenly the story changes. Not slightly, completely. What if that reconciliation wasn't reconciliation at all? What if it was positioning? What if it was access? What if it was a door quietly being reopened, not for healing, but for leverage? Because King Charles didn't just invite Harry and Meghan into a room. King Charles opened a door at a moment of vulnerability, a moment when the entire world knew he was facing something deeply personal, something fragile, something that should have demanded loyalty, not negotiation.
What we know is frantic because we know Harry is desperate, and he was desperate before losing to the Daily Mail. Just think how desperate he is now.
And that's where the tension sharpens into something darker. Because before that meeting even happened, there were conditions, not written, not signed, but understood. Keep it private, keep it contained, keep it sacred. But what happens when the very thing meant to stay hidden becomes the first thing to surface?
Eager Charles has always hoped to see his grandchildren. He's still undergoing treatment for cancer, and family matters more than ever. Despite years of public fallout, he would not pass up the opportunity to privately see his grandchildren. This is true, and what's happened is Archie and Lily have been the trump card. That is what Harry and Meghan have leveraged, and they have won on that one. So it's interesting with Harry and Meghan, but they've had a good week and a bad week. A bad week losing the court case.
Harry agreed. Harry promised. And yet, within days, not weeks, the silence was broken. Not carefully, not subtly. Publicly, the kind of public that doesn't just whisper, it broadcasts.
And this, remember, is on the back of a very private meeting. Whatever the other people say, a very private meeting behind the scenes with His Majesty the King, throughout with Queen Camilla. And this is the thanks that they get for that particular time. He was warned, and obviously I'm sure William's thinking, told you so?
And this is where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. Because while the palace believed this was about family, about rebuilding something broken, the actions that followed didn't reflect reconciliation, they reflected contradiction. Immediate contradiction, loud contradiction, a podcast appearance that raised eyebrows, public behavior that didn't match private promises, and underneath it all, a growing question that nobody could quite shake: what was the real objective? Because if you step back, if you stop looking at each moment as isolated and instead connect them, the pattern doesn't just appear, it becomes undeniable. Promises made, promises broken, statements given, actions reversed, a desire for privacy paired with constant visibility. And then comes the detail that changes everything: the money. Not rumored, not implied, visible. Because when Harry appeared in situations built entirely around his royal identity, when Meghan stepped into platforms that quietly leaned on that same status, something shifted. It wasn't just participation, it was monetization. And that's where the leak becomes explosive. Because the moment a secret deal is even hinted at, an arrangement, a request, a negotiation behind closed doors, the entire narrative flips. Suddenly, the reconciliation looks less like healing and more like strategy. Suddenly, every appearance looks less like coincidence and more like coordination. And King Charles notices. Because this isn't just about a broken promise anymore. This is about a repeated pattern that leads to one uncomfortable conclusion. Every move seems to circle back to the same point: money. And when that realization settles in, the response isn't emotional, it's decisive. Because cutting off funds isn't just a reaction, it's a signal, a line drawn, a quiet message that says something has gone too far. And here's where it gets even more intense. Because the timing of everything happening around this moment makes it feel less accidental and more like pressure building from every direction at once. Deals that didn't perform the way they were expected to. Partnerships that quietly faded. Projects that failed to deliver the impact they promised. And suddenly, the need for new opportunities becomes urgent, almost desperate. And in that desperation, the choices start looking different, not strategic, not careful, risky. Because when the financial pressure rises, the lines between private and public blur. The lines between family and opportunity blur. And that's when the biggest mistakes happen, not because they were unavoidable, but because they were predictable. And people were watching. They were watching when the promises were made. They were watching when the promises were broken. And now they're watching the fallout. Because what started as a family conflict has transformed into something far more serious: a question of motive, a question of trust, and a question that lingers in every corner of this story. Was it ever really about reconciliation? Or was it always about access, influence, and ultimately money? And just when it feels like the situation couldn't escalate any further, it does. Because behind the scenes, something shifts again. And this is where the story stops pretending to be about isolated incidents and starts revealing something far more structured, far more deliberate. Because once the idea of a financial motive enters the picture, every past action begins to rearrange itself into a sequence that feels less accidental and more like a chain reaction that was always heading toward this exact outcome. The court case loss doesn't just sit quietly in the background anymore, it suddenly becomes central. Because losing so publicly, losing so completely, creates pressure, and pressure demands solutions. And those solutions rarely come in the form of patience or silence when the stakes are this high. Instead, what follows is movement, fast movement, almost frantic, where appearances increase, visibility increases, and the need to stay relevant becomes undeniable. And when relevance becomes survival, every opportunity starts to look less like a choice and more like a necessity that cannot be ignored. And that's why the timing becomes impossible to dismiss, because everything seems to collide at once: the failed expectations, the financial strain, the public perception shifting in real time, and the quiet realization that the support system that once existed is no longer guaranteed, no longer accessible in the way it used to be. Because cutting off funds doesn't just remove money, it removes security, it removes leverage, it removes the safety net that allowed certain risks to be taken without consequence. And when that safety net disappears, the consequences don't just arrive, they accelerate. Suddenly, every decision carries weight, every move carries risk, and every misstep becomes amplified in a way that cannot be controlled once it's out in the open. And what makes this even more unsettling is how predictable it starts to feel when you step back and look at it without distraction. Because the signs were always there, quietly repeating themselves, quietly building toward this moment where everything would finally converge. The promises about privacy, the statements about stepping away, the insistence on independence, all of it begins to clash with the visible actions that followed, creating a contradiction that becomes harder and harder to explain away as just coincidence. Because you can only claim distance from something for so long before your actions reveal how closely tied you still are to it. And when that connection becomes a source of income, a source of opportunity, a source of survival, the narrative shifts whether anyone wants it to or not. And this is the part that creates the deepest tension. Because it forces a question that doesn't have an easy answer, a question that sits uncomfortably at the center of everything that has happened. If the intention was truly independence, why does every major move seem to depend on the very thing that was supposedly left behind? And if the intention was reconciliation, why does every step after that private meeting seem to push further away instead of closer? Because those contradictions don't just confuse the public, they create doubt. And once doubt enters the story, it doesn't leave quietly, it grows, it spreads, and it begins to shape the way every future action is interpreted before it even happens. And somewhere in the middle of all this, something else begins to shift, something quieter but far more powerful. Because while one side of the story becomes louder, more reactive, more unpredictable, the other side becomes almost silent, almost still. And that silence starts to carry its own weight. Because silence in this situation isn't weakness, it's observation, it's calculation. It's a decision to step back and watch as everything unfolds without interference, without reaction, allowing the actions themselves to speak louder than any response ever could. And that kind of silence is dangerous because it doesn't escalate the situation, it contains it, it frames it, and it lets the consequences arrive without resistance. And as those consequences begin to take shape, the bigger picture starts to come into focus. Because this is no longer just about one decision or one moment, it's about what happens next. And what happens next feels like it's already been set in motion. Because once trust is broken in a way that becomes public, once financial support is removed in a way that becomes undeniable, the path forward narrows and the options become fewer, and every future move becomes more predictable, more limited, more desperate. And that's when the real question begins to take hold, not about what has already happened, but about what is still coming. Because if this is the point where everything has been exposed, where the motivations have been questioned, where the support has been cut, then what happens when the pressure continues to build without anything left to absorb it? Because the truth is, this doesn't feel like an ending, it feels like a transition, a shift into something far more uncertain, far more unstable, where the next move matters more than any move that came before it, and where every decision will be watched, analyzed, and judged through the lens of everything that has already happened. And if the pattern continues the way it has been, if the contradictions continue, if the pressure continues, then the next chapter won't just be another controversy, it will be something bigger, something that changes the entire direction of the story in a way that can't be undone once it begins.